All of these colourful prints have been made using the Collagraph technique, and Collagraph means drawing with collage. And these collages have been made onto a stiff piece of mount card. Collages can be made out of a lot of different materials. Some people use different textured papers that they glue firmly down to the cardboard base, and then they need to seal that whole Collagraph plate to make it waterproof. These collagraphs have actually been made, rather than using paper, I've used these offcuts of vinyl, which I've got from the local scrap store. And the advantage of using this vinyl material is that you don't need to seal the plate because it's already waterproof. And you don't need to wait for any glue to dry. You just peel off the backing paper, and then this is sticky enough to stay down on the board of the Collagraph. A nice thing about these two vinyls is that they're different textures. So you can see that the blue one's matte and the grey one's very shiny. I've also got some of this spotty stuff, which again is sticky backed. When you get to the black surface, it's very sticky, and that can be cut and stuck to the plate. And these different materials all have different effects in the print. So I'll just show you the dotty material. That's how it printed in this case. So to show you how these two textures print, the matte material and the shiny material, I've got this print here that was made using those two textures. This is the one that was actually used to make the print, and this is a duplicate plate. And I've just made this so you can see the textures of the material. And the shiny material is cleaned up to give you almost white tree trunks, and the matte material that I've used for the grass has held on to a lot more ink. The mount card itself is quite absorbent, so you've got quite a dark colour there. And if I bring this closer in, you can see I've also used the dry point tool to put some detail in. And I've used a scalpel to cut areas and peel off a surface of the material. So I'll just demonstrate that now. So to make those branches, I've used a scalpel to actually cut into the card. And as long as I make sure that that shape is cut all the way around, I can just use the tip of the scalpel to lift out that piece. And by doing that, I've exposed an even heavier texture there and a more absorbent layer of card. So that will give us a darker colour when printed, and you can see the effect there in the branches and in the detail on the tree trunks themselves. I wanted to show you this plate and print. So this is the Collagraph plate, and this is the print taken from it. And I'm just showing you this because it's a little bit more experimental, and I've used things like electrical tape and parcel tape and those hole punch reinforcers, a little bit of this metallic foil tape, which is quite nice because when you scrunch a texture into it, it kind of keeps a little bit of that texture. And you can also dry point into this material really effectively, and it will hold the marks that you make, which is what I've done here for the bird. And I wanted to talk to you about that because you can experiment with different tapes you have around the house. So there's some electrical tape, some masking tape, even sellotape, and it's all about the texture. So the shinier the material, like the sellotape, the whiter the print will be, and the more matte the texture, the more ink it will hold. So it's quite a nice idea to make a plate which is quite random and experimental, so you can see what effect the found materials have. The other thing to mention is that these prints are made using more than one colour of ink. So I've got a turquoise and a blue in this print, and I've got a yellow and a red in this print. And it tends to be that in these Intaglio type printings, the colours will blend really beautifully together, and blending the colours does work really well. So I'm going to go ahead now and make a simple collagraph plate for you to see the process and see the effects that those different materials have in the print. I'm going to start with some of this shiny material. This is a piece of very shiny textured material on the matte texture of the plate, so there should be good contrast between these two. And this is the matte material. I'm going to stick that across so that you'll have a bit of contrast between the shiny here and the matte here, but these two tones might be fairly similar. And I think we'll also see the ridges just there where it overlaps the other piece. This is the foil. I'm going to scrunch this to give it more texture, but then I'm going to open it out again so that I don't have any large overhangs that might trap the ink. But you can see there is a little bit of texture on there. And this is generally a shiny material, so it should clean up quite well, except for where the ink is trapped in all of these little creases. I'm also going to draw a little bit in with the dry point tool. So now I'm going to use the scalpel and do some incisions right into the card and through some of the tape that's on the card as well. If you're using something like this electrical tape, then you will probably need a cutting mat to cut shapes out from it. The way I cut shapes is to stick a piece to the cutting mat and then cut the shapes I want out of the piece. Just lift that out with the scalpel to help me get started, and then I can put that in place. And the nice thing is that we're left with a piece with the corresponding shapes, and that might be interesting to include into the collagraph, so I'm going to stick that down as well. You can also do dry point directly into the mount board base of your collagraph. So I'll put some marks in here and over some of the tapes as well. It should show up nicely there. This is quite a big area of exposed, heavily textured material, so I'm going to use some of this Rustin's button polish, and with a paintbrush I'm just going to paint in some of that to seal that area. And it's going to be a very thin layer of polish that we need on there, and it doesn't matter too much if you overlap because it should sink in the material and not show up. But I am careful not to put too much onto the top surface, just in case. Another texture you could try is to use some varnish. So this is just household varnish, it's waterproof. And I've got a stick here which I use to apply it to the surface. You could use varnish in a painterly way. You can apply it with a paintbrush if you want to. I just find applying it with a stick means I don't ruin any paintbrushes. And you can see what kind of different marks you could make using the stick in different ways. Also, when it's sort of tacky, almost dry, you can draw into that surface. And some people create whole prints that way, either using varnish or a waterproof PVA. And they're both really nice ways of creating a more painterly textured effect onto your Collagraph. Before I can print this, I need to make sure that the varnish and the shellac are completely dry, so leave it overnight or speed up the process with a hairdryer. My Collagraph plate is now totally dry, all the varnish is solid, and I've pushed down the edges of all the tapes to make sure they're really firmly attached to the plate and that there's no areas where the ink could go underneath the tapes and create a big smudge over my print. So now I'm ready to ink it up, and I'm going to use a little cut off piece of mount card to spread the ink. And first of all, I'm going to use some of this green ink in this corner, and just like with the dry point, I spread the ink at about a 45-degree angle, and that helps pull it over the plate. But you can see I'm going backwards and forwards with this because there's so much more texture now that needs to be filled with ink. So if I just pull down in one direction, you can see that a lot of the time the ink will miss, and I'll need to go back the other way in order to make sure it's well inked. It's particularly tricky around all those dots, those varnishy dots, because of how heavy the texture is there. So it's easier to put this ink on fairly thickly in those areas and then scrape it back to a thinner layer of ink. Just like with the dry point, make sure that you take the ink right to the edge of your printing plate. I'm going to also use a turquoise in this print. I'm using a separate card spreader for each colour so that I can keep the colours separate on the plate until I decide to mix them. I think that's ready. Just like with the dry point, the first thing I'm going to do is blot the excess ink away. So I'm using a scrap piece of newsprint and I'm just rubbing quite firmly across the back of the plate. The next part of the process is a little bit different to the dry point. I don't use scrim generally when I polish a Collagraph plate. I use newsprint, and I have two pieces of paper. One is for holding the plate in place, and the other is for polishing the surface. And once I've done a little with one, I use this one to hold, and I use this one to polish. If you've got more than one colour on your plate, you need to be careful not to mix the two colours together. So at this stage I'm going to put those two pieces away, grab some clean fresh pieces and repeat the process, holding with one hand and polishing with the other. I'm keeping my hand that's doing the polishing nice and flat so that I'm polishing at the same rate with the same pressure over the whole plate. And that's because I want the surface texture to do the work. I don't want to influence where the ink stays and where it goes. That's all been done in the making of the plate. Once there's a bit of ink on these papers, get some new ones. Where there's quite heavy texture, you'll find that the paper sticks to the plate, so you'll get through quite a lot. And you can even do some extra blotting in those areas by holding the paper down and rubbing the back, and that should just lift off all the excess ink, and then it will allow your paper to slide over the surface. There's quite a lot of excess ink in the recess I cut into the plate, so I'm going to blot that. until it looks a bit less sticky. You don't want the ink on the surface to have a kind of sticky, wet appearance. You want it to be quite smooth. So I'm nearly there with this plate. I'm just going to give a final polish to bring up any white areas of the print. So over any of the shiny materials, I want them to print nice and bright and white. So I'm just going to give a final polish to kind of buff those areas up a bit. And I'd say that's ready now to print. So I've got my Collagraph plate on the bed of the press, and it's central on the scrap paper behind, which gives me a guide for placing the printing paper centrally as well. It's got a nice emboss around the print, and also some of the texture that we put on the surface is embossed as well. So I'm going to carefully peel the print back from the plate. So here's a closer look at the print compared to the printing plate, and we can see that all the shiny materials, so the grey piece of shiny vinyl here has come up nice and bright. The foil tape has come up bright. The top of the varnish dots have come up nice and bright, and the ink has collected around them as well to give those really effective little spots. The more matte material, so the blue here and the electrical tape, have held on to a little bit more ink, but not as much as the background or the recesses where I carved into the plate. So that's the carving there, and you can see how much ink has been left in there and in the smaller one here. And you can see that the dry point tool was quite effective at making some strong marks across the plate. This area here was the varnish that I applied with the stick and then scraped through it to give those kind of nice deep ridges. So far we've looked at Intaglio inking, and this is where the ink is pushed into the plate, into all of the texture that you've created with your Collagraph materials. And now I want to show you relief inking, and relief is about putting ink on just the surface. So I'm using a lino roller, and I've rolled out a contrasting colour. And now I'm going to roll that over the surface of the plate, and we're just going to see where the ink lands. And you can put as much or little of this relief ink onto your plate as you want. So I'm going to send this through the press now and see what that looks like. This is the print here, and this is the plate, and I just wanted to show you close up some of the interesting effects that have been made. So we've got these nice red spots within a halo of blue, and we've got the red contrasting really strongly with the green in the background. And in this area, some really interesting texture made by the roller and just catching on the top of that varnished area there. So you can imagine how you could use combine these two inking processes to make some really highly contrasting prints. Here's a few examples of prints that combine those two inking processes, the Intaglio inking and the relief inking, and it gives you a really good range of textures and colour combinations to play with. It's worth experimenting with these two types of inking and be quite open to the results, because it can be unexpected sometimes. And once you get the hang of it, you can exploit the kind of colour combinations and textures in a more composed piece of work.